Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear students, in the preceding lecture, you have studied about the effects of environmental changes on poverty. I have explained you the three dimensions of poverty: opportunity, capability and security. In this lecture, you will study about poverty environment related some hypotheses. Key hypotheses are downward spiral hypothesis, the Baker-Mann hypothesis, Porter hypothesis. So, these three hypotheses will be discussed in detail in this lecture, and you will also study about some myths related to environment and poverty relation, and finally, I will explain you some strategy that are required to improve the environment and reduce the poverty. Now, another topic or subsection here is poverty and environment linkages, some hypotheses. So, there are certain kind of hypotheses related to the poverty environment nexus. The environment poverty nexus is a two-way relation. Environment affect poverty situations in three distinct dimensions, as I already discussed in the preceding lecture, by providing source of livelihood to the poor people, by affecting the health and by influencing the vulnerability. So, in fact, these are the three key dimensions of the poverty. Providing source of livelihood means opportunity, affecting their health means capability, and by influencing their vulnerability means security. So, opportunity, capability and security, these are the three distinct dimensions of poverty. On the other hand, poverty also affects environment in various ways, by forcing the poor people to degrade the environment, by encouraging countries to promote high economic growth at the expense of environment, and by inducing society to downgrade environmental concerns. These things I also discussed earlier. Now, if you look at the relationship, then we have the two views. First view is poverty leads to environmental degradation. Second is environmental degradation lead to poverty increase. So, it is popular claim that poverty leads to environmental degradation like deforestation, shifting cultivation, depletion of common property resources, indoor pollution due to firewood, poor sanitation, etc. So, all these are the effects of poverty that affects the environment. Poor people have shorter time horizon, so they give more weight to short term, and poverty increases risk aversion and discount rate. So, poor people have shorter time horizon. This is one argument that poor people give more weight to short term, and therefore, they try to maximize their return in the short run and may ignore the long run sustainability. Second argument is poverty increase risk aversion and discount rates. So, poor people have high discount rate for the current as compared to the future, and they take less risk, and therefore, they give more weight to the present rather than to the future, and that have adverse impact on environmental degradation. Then environmental degradation lead to poverty. This is second argument. So, second argument is not only poverty lead to environmental degradation, but environmental degradation also lead to poverty increase. How? By declining their livelihood base. Second, by impacting their health and productive capabilities. So, when environmental degradation occurs, it affects the health and productive capability of the poor people, and due to this their income earning capability also affected, and they may go further into deep poverty. And third is by enhancing their vulnerability to environmental and climatic risk. So, vulnerability to environmental and climatic risk is very high among the poor people. This graph shows the linkage between sustainable development, environment and poverty, and it is very interesting. So, you can discuss this graph: environmental problems, pollution, land degradation, climate change, and here there are two vicious cycle. First vicious cycle is related to poverty. So, pollution of poverty, and here you can see how poverty is affecting the environmental degradation. Poverty elevation is related to, as I already told you, meeting basic needs like health, education, shelter, productive employment, control over common property resources and population control. So, these are the measures which required to reduce the poverty, and that reduction in poverty is directly lead to link to the sustainable development. But at the same times, when natural resource deplete and degraded, that increase the poverty and people move into the vicious circle of poverty. So, that vicious circle of poverty is related to environmental degradation and poverty nexus, which I already discussed. But another important things, when we try to establish the relationship between environment, poverty and sustainable development, then major component of environmental degradation is not because of poverty, it is because of affluence. Means when a country's economic growth increases, and when the growth is coming from most polluted industries, then pollution level will increase, and resource depletion and degradation also occurs, like agro based industries or coal based industries, natural resource based industries. So, when we set up these kind of industries which require natural resources, and by increasing the economic growth we also deplete the natural resources. But at the same time there are many industries which increase the growth of the economy, but also release various form of waste, liquid, gaseous and solid waste into the atmosphere, and that increase the pollution level and generate the vicious circle of poverty second. So, both circle are valid. One is related to poverty and environment, and other is the high growth rate and pollution relationship, and integration of environment into development is very necessary to address this pollutions of affluence circle or vicious circle of relation. Like what you have to do is, you have to do environmental impact assessment of many development projects. Like in India, EI is mandatory for all those projects which have some environmental implication. Technology for development is very important. Rural urban migration is another important issue. Renewable energy issues, regional and international cooperation. So, by addressing all these issues we can achieve the sustainable development. Now, we can discuss several hypotheses which are directly related to the poverty environment nexus. First hypothesis is downward spiral hypothesis. This hypothesis maintains that poor people and environment damage are often caught in a downward spiral, according to Jian and Umana in 2003. People in poverty are forced to deplete resources to survive, and this degradation of environment further improves people. So, this actually I already discussed in the preceding slide, the relationship between sustainable development, environment and poverty. So, actually this hypothesis clearly mentioned that poor people damage environment, and since poor people depend more on natural resources, so they degrade the environment, and when environment is degraded, then the people depending on the environment due to degradation of environmental resources, they further go into poverty. So, this becomes a vicious circle of poverty. Environmental degradation can sometimes be associated with poverty, but there is not necessarily a direct causal relationship between poverty and environment. So, although this hypothesis shows that the environmental degradation lead to poverty and poverty lead to environmental degradation, but empirical evidence shows that there are many other issues, many other factors which also affect the environment, not just the poverty. So, this hypothesis has certain limitations, because empirical evidences cannot show that only the poverty is responsible for the environmental degradation, as we discussed in the preceding graph. Second hypothesis is Baker-Mann hypothesis. The hypothesis maintains that as the growth provides accumulated assets, these assets can be used to reduce the environmental degradation. It makes sense to degrade now and pay later to put these things right. So, it is very interesting that according to this hypothesis, that when economic growth increases, then accumulated assets capital can be used for environmental improvement. So, environmental degradation can be reduced by making more investment on improving the environment, since economic growth is releasing more assets for this. But point here is that is there any guarantee that the accumulated assets will be invested to improve the environment? This is one issue. Second is grow now and clean up later. Is it a good strategy? So, and most of the countries now making this argument that first you improve the economic growth, and when economic growth is leading to pollution, then you make investment to clean the environment. So, this kind of strategy, grow now and clean up later, is not a good strategy and not a sustainable strategy, and this hypothesis seems to be undermine the need for conscious policy interventions. And another thing is that it takes a simplest approach towards the intergenerational equity issues. It basically says that there will be physical degradation at present, but the monetary compensation will be made in future. What does it mean? It means that you generate income today and invest on clean environment tomorrow, but tomorrow who will bear the burden? The next generation. So, intergeneration equity is also the important issues when we discuss the Baker-Mann hypothesis. Then third hypothesis is the Porter hypothesis. The Porter hypothesis states that high level of environmental protections are compatible with high level of economic growth and may encourage innovation and support growth. This hypothesis makes two fundamental points. First, environmental protection is justified not only for the sake of environmental improvement, but also for increasing the economic growth. Second, if people see the economic value of environmental protection, initiatives may be undertaken for innovations in technology, input mix and management to increase resource use efficiency and also to minimize resource waste and the adverse environmental impact on production. So, this Porter hypothesis clearly indicate that if economic growth increases, then environmental protection can also be achieved. Means environmental protection is compatible with the economic growth, and the major argument here is that innovations and technology would lead to resource conservation in the economy, and better environmental conditions will improve due to technological interventions, due to high level of resource use efficiencies and due to better waste management, as a country has more resources because of increase in GDP growth rate to invest on waste management, cleaning the wastewater, etc. So, it will lead to better environmental conditions. But this hypothesis can lead to an extreme situation, thereby environmental standards are imposed on trade. So, one of the issue in this regard is that some countries may use high environmental standard as a trade barrier for other countries, and in fact in WTO this issue several times came into discussion that the environmental standards should be introduced in the multilateral trading system. So, for example, if India want to export dairy products, and if in processing and producing the dairy product the hygienic conditions are not met, high level of environmental standards are not met, then our dairy products in international market may not be acceptable. So, it may be indirectly a restriction on the trade if we try to introduce these environmental standards in relation to trade. There are certain myths regarding the relationship between environment and poverty. First is poor people are the principal creator of environmental damage. This is a simple myth, and you can see some empirical evidences that large number of pollution that is occurring in most of the countries are not because of poverty, but it is because of high growth of industrialization, urbanization, etc. So, this is simply a myth that poor people degrade more environment as compared to the rich people, because rich people consume more resources, they consume more energies and also release more waste into the atmosphere. Therefore, this simply seems to be a myth. Population growth lead to environmental degradation. Again, this is also a debatable issue and seems to be a myth whether population growth would lead to environmental degradation, etc. Then third is poverty environment nexus basically stem from low income. So, this is also a myth that environmental degradation and occurs because of the low level of income, or in developing countries where level of income is quite low. And now let me just discuss in brief what kind of strategies we can adopt to improve the environment and reduce the poverty. So, what you need is you have to understand who are the poor, where they are. So, if we know in which region the poor concentrate, in which activities the poor concentrate, and who are they, whether they belongs to the marginalized group, whether they are landless labor, whether they are PT small vendors, etc. So, if we know who are the poor and where are they, then certainly an appropriate policy interventions can be made to reduce the poverty. Then extent to which they depend on natural resources for their livelihood. So, we should also understand up to what extent the poor people depend on natural resources for their livelihood and where and how these natural resources are being degraded. Then appropriate actions in terms of policy can be initiated. Then their coping strategies. So, we should also conduct studies, and of course, many studies are being done how the poor people follow the coping strategies in order to have the or mitigate the adverse impact of climate change or environmental harsh or adverse environmental conditions. What sort of institution mediate entitlement to various assets and CPR. So, that is also important to understand how pollution and other environmental factors like dirty drinking water, dirty air, lack of sanitation affect the health of the poor. So, studies are required to know up to what extent the pollution and other environmental factors affect the health of the poor people, so that appropriate actions can be taken in terms of policy to address these issues, and the way in which the poor are vulnerable to natural shocks or disasters like drought, flood, earthquake. These understanding of these issues are very important to follow the appropriate strategies. Let me now explain the figure 2 aligning the analytical approach with the overall policy framework that is suggested by United Nations Development Program and United Nations Environmental Program handbook in 2009. Here goals, cross cutting issues, implementation strategies and targets. So, goal is growth, governance, income generation, increase resilience, human development. So, ultimately what we have to do is, the ultimate goal is to achieve the human development. So, here identify the key poverty environment linkages. So, one has to identify the key environment poverty linkages and focus is on growth, governance, income generation, increase resilience of poor people to natural shocks, risk, and ultimately to achieve the human development. Now, how this can be achieved? Crop like poverty reduction, environmental and gender issues, they are cross cutting issues. So, you cannot prepare only it is not a function of only single ministry, because environment issue should be part and parcel of all departments and ministries, so that environmental conditions can be improved and poverty can be reduced. So, in order to establish or capture the poverty and environmental linkages, then these two issues are crop cutting, the cross cutting issues which can be not limited to only one ministry or one department, but across ministries and department. Then as far as implementation strategy is concerned, as I in the very beginning told you, who are the poor, where are they. So, if we know the majority of the poor people are engaging in agriculture as a small farmers or agriculture laborers, then priority must be given on agriculture, then environment, then water, health, energy. So, these are the sectors where policy interventions required to be made to influence the priority strategies. And finally, the target is to improve the agriculture, forestry, water, health and energy, and include the target in monitoring framework of any policies. So, let me now just wind up or sum up this lecture. First point we had discussed in this lecture is poverty environment nexus is a two-way relation. So, when we try to establish the linkage between poverty and environment, then you have to keep in mind that this relationship is in a two-way system. Poverty and environment relation is not very simple. So, you cannot simply establish the relationship between poverty and environment. It is very complex and it is mediated through various macro and micro level factors such as policy measures, market and prices, local institution arrangement, gender relation, property rights, entitlement to natural resources, etc. Lack of well defined property rights, poor regulatory mechanism and weak governing institutions are rather more responsible for environmental degradation than poverty. So, apart from poverty, there are many other factors like well defined property rights. Why there is a overgrazing of common property resources, or why there is a tragedy of commons, or why there is a over stress on the common property resources. One of the argument made is that since there is no well defined property rights, so by instituting the well defined property rights, many of the issues related to environmental protections can be solved if the property rights are well defined. Moreover, if we have effective regulatory and monitoring mechanism, and if we have the strong governing institutions. So, with this I thank you all.